Alright, I've been talking a lot about gameplay, but now it's time to start talking about the more tertiary aspects of Elden Ring, starting with the audio and sound related content. This will of course be much more subjective, however I will try and bolster my perspective with any objective points I can surmise. Once again, and for those new to my channel, I'm by no means an audio expert, I'm not a musician, I'm not a sound engineer or something. I'm very much a layman in this regard. But I still want to talk about it because there is a lot worth discussing, and there are honestly certain tracks that deserve to be highlighted for just how good they are. Elden Ring's audio quality on the whole is pretty rock solid. I don't think I'd go as far as to call it exceptional, since there is little about it that I think can't also be said about Dark Souls 3 and even Sekiro, but that's not an insult by any means either. Souls games have this sort of ethereal sound to them that's difficult to explain but also easy to present. There's the sound effects of magic, the distinct clash of metal when a sword hits a shield, the horrific roars of bestial and demonic enemies, the swoosh of gigantic weaponry being swung with enough force to crack the earth, everything sounds perfectly serviceable. Something to note about past From games was the distinct lack of ambient music. Levels like the Undeadburg and even Izalith managed to establish some incredible tones with their use of silence, but I'm not so sure how well that would have worked with a game as massive in scope as Elden Ring. Areas in games like Dark Souls are far more compact, and your time in them is much more limited as a result, so making whole new tracks for these areas didn't serve much of a purpose versus allowing them to breathe and thus cultivate their own unique atmospheres solely off their visuals and occasional use of environmental audio. Elden Ring features environments which are far more expansive, so it makes sense while out in the open world to utilize ambient music to establish and maintain consistent tones for each section of the map. I think it was really smart on the part of FromSoft to recognize that silent rides on Torrent across gaps as massive as those in Liurnia would have been pretty boring, to put it mildly. It's nice to have that added touch to keep your mind active as you anticipate your next objective. Moments like the various battles with much larger enemies or discovering something new all benefit from the typically chill tones of the ambient tracks as well. With everything appearing to be so calm or even downright depressing, moments like a Gil crashing down to the earth become far more impactful than they otherwise would be, allowing you to properly take in the full scale and impact of this dragon's arrival, and that goes doubly for Lanciax. Discovering Placidusax has this unmatched tension that finally sees a release as the battle begins, and he bellows that screen-shaking roar. God, he is so cool! Discovering the Lake of Rot, hearing the details of the storm in Fire Missoula, or even walking into boss arenas like Estelle's, all land much more effectively in contrast to the typical background music of the overworld. It's also pretty impressive that none of these ambient tracks manage to feel repetitive given how frequently the player will typically be moving from place to place. And I appreciate again that every background track is entirely unique to that area. Imagine if there were only one or two themes that played for the majority of areas in the game. Or heck, what if that was the case for the game's bosses? Oh wait. As far as what I would consider standout audio effects of Elden Ring, there's the noise that the spirits make, the otherworldly sounds of distinctly alien creatures like Estelle, the headphone blasting booms of the god-devouring serpent, Godfrey's casting of Sarosh, and perhaps my favorite of all, Placidusax's nuke. Dude, that is so fucking godly. There's also a surprising amount of audio cues designed to assist the player in battle. Souls games have always done really well with these, and Elden Ring is far from an exception. If anything, Elden Ring is probably the most effective with this use of audio cues, be it the distinctly heavy noise of an incoming attack, the singing of the children in Renala's first phase, Malekith's blade as he attempts a parryable attack, Malenia as she prepares to summon the Scarlet Spirits, or even Placidusax appearing in the storm as he's about to attempt a dive bomb. There is a lot for the player to pick up on. Sometimes it is a bit too subtle, or maybe it's a problem with the mixing given just how much can be going on at any one time, but for the most part they do a really good job. Something I find fascinating about audio cues is that even though they technically should break immersion, they actually do a great job at helping to achieve the exact opposite. With Elden Ring's abundance of audio cues, it's easy to become heavily immersed when entering combat with particularly difficult enemies. I won't pretend that all of these enemies do a great job at maintaining that immersion, but as far as getting you there, I think Elden Ring does a great job. Being prompted to fully engage your sense of hearing within the game's world is something that few games can really command nowadays. Sure, it's nice to have a game with great audio quality that complements a solid headset, and it can play a role in PvP games, such as Overwatch or Call of Duty, but for a single-player game to invite you into its world by providing a tangible benefit to immersing yourself in its auditory content is honestly commendable. There's definitely a sense of repetition with certain effects, like the constant swooshing of swords, primarily due to the ludicrous amount of wombo combos, and it's undeniable that many of the audio effects are carried over from prior From games, but that's about the extent of my problems with the audio, at least from what I can recall from my time throughout the game. Overall, the non-diegetic audio is pretty damn great. However, it's when we get to the game's soundtrack that things get a little more complicated. I don't want to go over every track in the game because that would just be really long-winded and not to mention repetitive and honestly uninformative at a point, but part of the reason for the game's extensive soundtrack is the number of composers that FromSoft got on board. Elden Ring boasts a whopping 5 musical composers for its OST. That's more than any of their past games by far, so I'm gonna be talking about their contributions to Elden Ring for the next little while. Now, I won't be able to play the tracks on their own for copyright reasons, and I should probably reiterate that I am by no means compositionally or otherwise musically savvy, but I would encourage you to comment your own thoughts regarding the OST and whatever praise or criticism that I may levy towards it. I'm sure many of you could offer more technical insight to this kind of stuff than myself, however I still want to put my best foot forward on the subject, because ultimately the music is an integral part of any Souls game, and Elden Ring is no exception. As I mentioned, Elden Ring boasts a total of 5 musical composers for its OST, those being Yuka Kitamura, Tsukasa Saitoh, Shoi Miyazawa, Yoshimi Kudo, and Tai Tomisawa. The orchestrations themselves were performed by the Budapest Film Orchestra. It's also worth noting that many of these composers have worked on prior From games, including Dark Souls 2, Bloodborne, Dark Souls 3, and Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice. I'm nowhere near as familiar with Sekiro's OST, though I will say I have enjoyed what I've heard whilst playing, and Dark Souls 2's OST is pretty mixed, but I can say that Dark Souls 3 and Bloodborne had some outstanding tracks, which I don't imagine will come as a shock to any of you watching this far in the critique. Starting out, Tsukasa Saitoh is no stranger to FromSoft, having worked on the OST for Bloodborne as well as the Old Hunters. Saito's contributions include the opening track, Limgrave, Roundtable Hold, Margit the Fell Omen, Morgoth the Omen King, Song of Lament, Song of Honor, and Radagon's theme, as well as having collaborated with Shoi Miyazawa on the end credit track. Elden Ring's main title theme is probably the game's most recognizable track for a multitude of reasons, and though I wouldn't call it bad, I wouldn't say that I am especially blown away by it either. Dark Souls 3 still takes the cake for best main menu track as far as I'm concerned. That shit was just Glorious. Elden Ring's main track doesn't really feel like it matches the tone and aesthetic of the game, at least not to me. The Lands Between is a dying and decrepit world, cursed by the whims of gods beyond our imagination and scarred from long-concluded wars between those who so foolishly abuse the power bestowed upon them by those gods. This realm is drowning in anguish and lament, and yet there's an undeniable beauty to the mysticism that belies the tragedy which envelops the land. To put it simply, this world is as beautiful as it is horrific. Our trek across the Lands Between isn't an epic ride to war, it's a melancholic journey punctuated by moments of wonder and awe at the lingering wills of the once great powers which refuse to die. Our journey isn't without battles of epic proportion and moments of grandiose spectacle, but these moments stand out because of just how much they juxtapose the typical sorrow and stillness that we see from the peninsula of the south all the way to the mountaintops of the north. Elden Ring's title theme seems to be trying to hype up the player with its heavy use of percussion and bellowing brass instruments which invoke a feeling of going into this epic fantasy war. And that's kinda strange given the typically methodical pacing of the game and its overall chill tone compared to games like, I don't know, Skyrim or Zelda or even The Witcher. Radagon's boss theme is a rendition of the main title theme, and while I appreciate the finality that it attempts to invoke as our quest reaches its close, it's honestly among my least favorite tracks in the game. I don't hate it, but it was pretty disappointing if I'm being perfectly honest. Radagon exists in a very weird slot within the game's finale, occurring right after the epic battle with Godfrey, and just moments before the complete and total train wreck that is the Elden Beast. Tonally speaking, Godfrey is an epic showdown with the first ever Elden Lord, at least among humans. And the Elden Beast, all problems aside, is trying to invoke a more subdued conclusion, reveling in the awe of this magical world as you are given the closest thing there is to beholding the outer gods. It's going for a feeling of wonder, showing the beauty of Elden Ring's unfathomably vast and ethereal power. Elden Beast is a terrible final boss, make no mistake, but I can't deny that the OST for it, as well as the general atmosphere, is honestly incredible. Radagon, however, is just another one-on-one that's been shoved in like a square block in a round hole, with very little besides its visual design to distinguish him from common enemies like the Crucible Knight or the Black Knife Assassins. So it's kinda weird hearing a rendition of the signature title track for what is ultimately a pretty mediocre and frankly low-energy preliminary boss fight. Aesthetically speaking, I also find it doesn't really fit Radagon's broken and malformed appearance, and the arena itself is also pretty dark, drab, and bland, so this epic and bombastic music just sticks out in a really weird way when put alongside these bleak and broken visuals. I'm more than a little familiar at this point with the lore and characters in this game to understand the gravitas of a showdown with Radagon specifically, but the music is still far more exciting than the actual fight which takes place, let alone the visuals that accompany it. I don't know if I'd really consider this an issue with the music or even the boss itself so much as the pairing of the two, which is really weird given how incredible past FromSoft final boss tracks have been. Alon's original score was a certified hood classic which did a great job of putting into perspective the menacing power of this fallen king. Gwyn's OST is iconic for its melancholy and aiding of the narrative impact. And the same goes for Gehrman, the Soul of Cinder, and hey, even Aldia. Radagon's theme just comes off as another one of Elden Ring's recycled assets. Honestly, I think they should have gone for something more akin to Elden Beast or maybe even Rennala. Radagon's lore, as well as Marika's by extension, is pretty tragic, so I feel like a more somber and melancholic track would have honestly done this fight wonders. I mean, hey, Gwyn wasn't exactly the most complex or bombastic final boss, but the arena, the lore, and the OST more than made up for it. If anything, the music will be what people always remember Gwyn for, and I feel like they missed the opportunity to do something similar with Radagon. I don't think they should have just ripped off or copied what they were going for with Gwyn. I just feel like a track more reflective of Radagon's lore and character would have been far more effective here than a bombastic rendition of the main title track. Moving on to one of the background tracks, Roundtable Hold is a theme that players will hear a great deal of throughout their playtimes. This track is just kinda strange to me, personally. I don't think it's bad, I just question the tone it's going for. Let me explain. When it comes to hubs, Soul's OSTs have always gone for more peaceful and somber tones so as to juxtapose the ferocity of the world just beyond them. Be it the Nexus, Firelink Shrine, Majula, the Hunter's Dream, or Firelink Shrine again, you were always provided with a sense of warmth and comfort upon returning, which was important for establishing a sense of both relief and reassurance for the player. Roundtable Hold seems to be going for something more uneasy and foreboding. It's hard to pinpoint exactly how, but the tone is very much contrary to the hub tracks which preceded it, and personally speaking, I'm just not a fan. I don't know, it feels like it's attempting to emphasize the trials and tribulations of the characters that come and go from the Hold. I mean, I understand the intention, and I admit that it is in line with the overall tone of the game and its story, but I just don't agree with applying that sort of tone to a setting meant to serve as a hub of safety and familiarity. You know what I mean? Am I making sense? Moving along, Song of Honor is a track that I think is honestly fantastic, especially after having read up on the making of it. This is the song that plays for the Festival of Radon, and it has a similar energy to the now iconic main menu track from Halo. Like, seriously, I know that sounds weird, but just give it a listen. The likeness is kind of uncanny. I used to not be that big a fan of the Song of Honor, but it's honestly grown on me over time. The build up to Radon is just so fantastic, and I honestly can't imagine it without the Song of Honor at this point. There is an argument to be made that it feels a bit subdued given the battle that's about to occur, but it would also be kinda weird to walk into this area and suddenly hear a boisterous and over-the-top track. So I've grown to appreciate the more subdued nature of it. Part of the reason that I think the Song of Honor stands out is the fact that the vocals were performed by the brass section of the Budapest Film Orchestra. The idea being that the tarnished in their warrior ilk would be better represented by less polished vocal performers. That kind of outside-the-box thinking goes a long way in making great media of any kind, and it definitely shines through in the final product. Song of Lament is another stellar example of background music. In fact, I'd honestly consider it among the better tracks in the game. This is the song heard from the chanting Winged Dames, and it's comprised of Latin lyrics which translate to the following. Alas, the land, once blessed, now has diminished. We, betrothed, destined to be mothers, now become tarnished. We have lamented and we have shed tears, but no one consoles us. Golden One, at whom were you angry? Souls games have always been known for their attention to detail, and this is among the best examples to be found in Elden Ring of the presentation tying so properly to the world and lore of the Lands Between. It deepens the world in a way that isn't necessary to be known, but will always be there for those willing to find it, and I think that's very fitting for a Souls game. I won't pretend that I'm especially fond of the chanting Winged Dames myself, mechanically speaking, that is, but knowing of the suffering that they endured following the Shattering does paint them in an all-new light as characters inhabiting this broken world. It also makes you wonder about many of the other minor enemies, most of which do in fact have some degree of lore worth finding. The song itself is appropriately somber, consisting solely of vocals that sound as if they're on the verge of breaking down into pure sorrow. The voice eloquently traces that line of letting one's tears shed as their throat closes up. Honestly, it's pretty harrowing. Unfortunately, this also leads into one of my biggest criticisms, if not my biggest criticism of Elden Ring's soundtrack on the whole. Song of Honor and the Song of Lament are excluded from this particular criticism, thankfully, but as it turns out, the remaining OST's vocals are not only complete and total gibberish, but apparently they were artificially produced with AI. I am a firm believer that AI has a rightful place in entertainment, but this is not one of them. And it does not sit well with me at all. Past games like Bloodborne, especially Bloodborne, excelled with their OSTs because of the complexity and the quality of their vocals. For Bloodborne specifically, Latin lyrics were often invoked so as to draw parallels with the events and characters whilst remaining consistent with the overall presentation. Lawrence the First Vicar's soundtrack is an exceptional piece of music thanks primarily to the lyrics, which tell of a man swallowed by the guilt of leading the people that he was meant to safeguard into an inescapable darkness. Lawrence is already a fascinating character in his own right, and the lyrics do a phenomenal job at conveying the harrowing bleakness that he must have endured upon finally beholding the consequences of his actions. And don't get it mistaken, Lawrence is far from the only example of this. Elden Ring's vocals carry no such significance whatsoever, again barring the Song of Honor and Song of Lament. Yeah, sometimes the vocals do a pretty good job, Godfrey's and Placidusax's OSTs definitely come to mind in that regard, but the fact that they ultimately don't mean anything just makes the OST feel lyrically hollow and lacking in substance. I truly, sincerely hope that FromSoft doesn't opt to use AI-generated lyrics and vocals ever again, because I honestly cannot fathom a positive to draw from this, other than, I guess, they saved some money. AI-generated lyrics may work in a more neo-futuristic setting, like Cyberpunk or even Mass Effect, but for Elden Ring, it just comes off as lazy. To be perfectly clear, to my knowledge, Cyberpunk and Mass Effect don't use AI-generated lyrics. I'm just saying that it would make sense in a futuristic setting where you could be using that as a sort of meta way to comment on the use of AI in music. But that's its own discussion entirely. The last of Saito's contributions that I'd like to discuss is the ending track, which I honestly consider the definition of a mixed bag. I don't imagine this is very controversial though, as I've heard a fair amount of distaste from Elden Ring fans regarding this track in particular. And truthfully, it's not hard to see why. It's basically a medley consisting of Godric, Morgott, Malekith, and the Elden Beast arrangements. I guess the intention was for it to feel like something of a summation of the journey, but it really just comes off as a lazy rehash. When I think back on some of the incredible ending OSTs of past Souls games, I'm immediately brought back to the moment that I beat those games. One Who Craves Souls and Nameless Song will never fail to immediately draw me back to either the Nexus or the Kiln of the First Flame. But for Elden Ring's ending track, I doubt I would recognize it just by the sound, and that's a shame. The real shame though is despite Elden Ring boasting far more story endings than any other From title before it, there only exists a single ending track to punctuate these finales. This was a colossal mistake on the part of FromSoft in my opinion, and frankly a disservice to the very idea of including so many endings. They're all punctuated with the exact same musical score, which frustratingly suggests that it didn't even matter what ending the player managed to achieve. I mentioned previously the senses of uncertainty and even dread that can be derived from these endings, however the full extent and context of these given tones varies immensely between the endings. Ronnie's ending, for instance, is perhaps one of the most potentially good and hopeful endings, with the implication being that whatever lies beyond in the Age of Stars is whatever we choose to make of it. I understand these endings lend themselves to interpretation given how vague and open-ended they can be, but I don't imagine that many would disagree with this assessment. And even if someone did, they would be able to understand why it is I gathered such a hopefulness from this ending in particular versus the others. Contrast the Age of Stars ending with the Blessing of Despair, the Lord of Frenzied Flame endings, and the differing tones are immediately apparent. The Blessing of Despair ending is one of complete and utter misery, with sickly horrors being afflicted on all who reside within the lands between and perhaps even beyond, as well as their children and their children's children forever true. Meanwhile, the Lord of Frenzied Flame ending sees you becoming Sauron and absolutely annihilating the lands between in a mind-shattering display of absolute power. Best ending, by the way. So why, pray tell, have endings this disparate been punctuated with the exact same song? I understand that not everyone is going to be as bothered by this as I am, and I think that's totally fine, but this is also the very last impression that the game is capable of providing, so how am I supposed to just ignore that? Regardless, I was honestly rather disappointed with Saito's contributions to Elden Ring's OST. This isn't to suggest that they're a weak composer. Like I said, they also worked on Bloodborne and the Old Hunters, and the OST for those were downright phenomenal. The next composer on the list is Shoi Miyazawa, whose contributions include their collaborative work with Tsukasa Saitoh on the ending theme, as well as the character creation music, Altus Plateau, The Subterranean Shunning Grounds, Crumbling Faramazula, Invader, Bloody Fingers, Falling Star Beast, Godric the Grafted, Star Scourge Radon, Moog the Lord of Blood, and Malekith the Black Blade. Right off the bat, I think Miyazawa did a really good job with their more atmospheric tracks. Character creation music has always been a pleasant accompaniment to the Souls creation suites, and Elden Ring is by no means an exception. Combine the warm and inviting tones of the music with this being undoubtedly FromSoft's biggest character creation suite so far, and the end result is pretty damn great. If nothing else, I imagine my numerous characters should serve as something of a testament to just how much I genuinely enjoy enjoyed creating them, and the character creation track was a huge contribution. Tracks like the Altus Plateau and the Crumbling Fire Missoula are also worth noting. They're by no means outstanding or the most bombastic tracks, but they do well to contribute to the atmosphere of these levels with the use of heavier and drawn-out notes. They really help to convey that these places have fallen from their historic heights. There's a sort of underlying sadness that permeates them, and I think that's very fitting. As far as boss themes go, I think Godric and Radahn's OSTs are both fantastic, despite the constant asterisk to that praise that is the AI-generated vocals. There's no escaping that criticism, but at least the music manages to be pretty good, even with that caveat. Godric's music feels like a sort of fantastical blend of the epic battle music you would expect from Dark Souls 3, as well as the thrilling chase music that you would find in Bloodborne, which makes sense given his horrific but also regal presentation. There's this over-the-top evil feeling to the music that does well to convey the twisted nature of his power, and it's simultaneously intimidating and exciting. His phase 2 proceeds to amp up the vocals and shrill instrumentation, creating a sense of panic and awe, which is fitting given Godric's grafting himself with the dragon head mid-fight. Radahn's music, on the other hand, sounds almost as if it was ripped right out of God of War, and I am here for it. It starts out relatively slow, acting as a sort of follow-up to the Song of Honor, which simultaneously matches up really well with the actual structure of the boss fight, which of course sees the player crossing a great distance in order to reach Radahn, at which point the real battle begins. It doesn't take long for the track to start amping up, making it very clear just what it is that you've gotten yourself into. This isn't some melancholic sad boy who can't defend himself. You came here to do battle with the demigod of war, and that's exactly what you're going to get. There's a constant sense of escalation to the music, as if to tell you repeatedly that you have seen nothing yet. Things are only just getting started, and not just with Radahn, but with the whole game. Then Radahn turns into a fucking meteor and the music comes crashing right back in with him. Now we've gone from an escalating war march to ground zero to a straight up fucking war. The vocals ramp up in order to sell the scope of the battle, the percussion really begins to storm in. Holy fuck, I am alive! This entire track feels like an auditory illustration of Radahn's sheer power and all that it's gonna take to bring him down. To put it simply, this track is excellent. Malekith's, on the other hand, is one that I started out somewhat conflicted on, but I've definitely grown to appreciate it more and more over time. I know that's probably filthy rich, coming from the guy who thinks Malekith's visual design is a complete dumpster fire of cringy Berserk OC energy, but the music is great. Malekith's boss track kicks off with a very low-key and menacing tone. It's hard to properly explain, but the mix of lighter feminine vocals and what I suspect are woodwind and even string instruments pair perfectly with the deeper masculine vocals as well as the bombastic brass and percussions in creating a tone that's as wondrous as it is terrifying. The whole track does a terrific job at establishing a grim tone for this particular point in the story, which conveys a significance to the Rune of Destined Death and what it would mean to acquire it. I might even go as far as to say the mix of brooding and foreboding ambiance makes the first phase of the song my personal favorite between the two, and that's not even to suggest that the second phase of the track is half bad either. I was initially expecting Malekith's phase 2 of the track to be yet another bombastic and noisy orchestration because, let's face it, that's what we've come to expect from these more over-the-top phase 2s. But I was pleasantly surprised that it didn't, given how ridiculous the boss itself turned out to be. Obviously, the track does pick up to match the second phase of the battle, however, it has this sort of melancholic, almost apocalyptic tone belying it, with regular points in the track where the music slows down so as to maintain the rich atmosphere of the fight. It goes a long way in conveying that this really is the last line of defense in Marika's Golden Order, and that stepping beyond this point means irrevocably altering the lands between forever. There is no going back from the Rune of Destined Death. This is the point of no return. One last thing of note regarding Malekith's theme is that this is one of the few tracks with a proper phase transition. Most of Elden Ring's tracks just kind of come to a hard stop when the phase 1 portion is over before ramping up in the phase 2. After that, it basically starts playing a whole new song. Again, see Radagon and the Elden Beast. Malekith is the only boss that I can think of where there's actually a middle portion to help transition between the phases, and honestly, that's great. The cutscene is still cringe, but props to Miyazawa for including a proper musical transition. You know what, come to think of it, Ludwig does the exact same thing. That's not a criticism, that's not even me making fun of the game, I just think it's a funny coincidence. Last but not least for Miyazawa's contributions is Moog's theme, and I have done a complete turnaround in my feelings towards this track. At first I really didn't think it was all that special, I thought it was just a generic Bloodborne-inspired boss track with little of note, but I don't know, something about watching this phase transition for a second time really cemented this track as one of my favorites in Elden Ring. That is so fucking epic. Moog's OST is clearly inspired by Bloodborne. Honestly, it would fit right in amongst that game's OST with the use of bells and more frenetic tempos. I used to see this as a negative, but honestly, after really going over the soundtrack again, and again, and many more agains, I consider that a strength more than anything. It's not as if there's any other tracks attempting to emulate that particular energy, barring maybe Estelle, and of course disregarding the OST with bosses like Midra and the Mother of Fingers. And it's not as on the nose as, say, Malekith's Hair. It's a tastefully inspired but still wholly original track that perfectly suits Moog and his utterly vile character, or so we thought. The next composer on the list is one Yoshimi Kudo, whose contributions to Elden Ring include The Caves, Liurnia of the Lakes, Old Castle, Mount Gelmir, Volcano Manor, Prison Town, Consecrated Snowfield, Old Warriors, Fallen Knights, Recussance, Lich Dragon Fortisax, and the God-Devouring Serpent, or Rykard the Blasphemous God. I honestly don't have too much to say about the majority of these tracks. They're all pretty decent with very little sticking out as either bad or exceptional, save for Lich Dragon Fortisax and the God-Devouring Serpent, both of which I would consider total knockouts. They are fantastic boss tracks. Maybe it's because I'm such a slut for pianos and violins. Okay, no, it is because I am a total slut for pianos and violins, but the use of them does a great job at giving Fortisax's track such a distinct energy. The piano creates such a unique backdrop for the rest of the orchestration to play off of, and the sudden use of violins gives the opening of the song a very strong sense of melancholy, which is appropriate given Fortisax's lore. As bombastic as the track is, it never feels as if it's completely overbearing you with sound or blasting out your eardrums with constant noise. Honestly, I could see this being one of my favorite tracks in the game if there were intelligible lyrics to accompany the composition. Imagine how much more depth they could have added to Fortisax and perhaps even Godwyn by extension with even a handful of Latin chants. A man can dream. Then there's the God-Devouring Serpent, and despite the boss itself obviously taking inspiration from Demon Souls, and I guess by extension Dark Souls 3, the OST actually feels more inspired by the original Dark Souls than anything. It's interesting, because the first phase feels akin to one of the more atmospheric boss tracks of Dark Souls like Gwendolyn or Sif, with its use of feminine vocals as it constantly builds and builds to an eventual peak. There's also a near ever-present use of string instruments that belies this phase of the track. Then the second phase hits, and suddenly we've shifted to deeper masculine vocals, as well as a renewed focus on heavy percussion and brass instruments. In fact, the start of phase 2 borders on sounding like something horrific, which is appropriate given the character this track accompanies. I also find it interesting that the music doesn't truly ramp up until Rykard's taken control, as if to suggest that despite having been devoured by the serpent, he is still far more dangerous than the serpent itself could ever have been. Next on the list of composers is Tai Tomisawa, who also composed for Sekiro's OST. Regarding Elden Ring's OST though, Tomisawa's contributions include Stormvale Castle, Mountaintops of the Giants, Mikula's Halig Tree, Elfile, or Elfale? I don't really know. I'm gonna call it Elfile. The second Formidable Foe track, Erdtree Knights, The Accursed, Red Wolf of Radagon, Erdtree Avatar, Godskin Apostles, Lord's Apparition, Estelle, Ancient Dragon Lanciax, Dragonlord Placidusax, and Godfrey, the first Elden Lord. I guess I'll go ahead and get this out of the way. I'm not a fan of the Formidable Foe tracks. I appreciate the work put into composing them, and the songs themselves really aren't half bad, but these are generic boss tracks, and I've probably made it clear by now that I'm not a fan of the existence of generic bosses in Elden Ring in general. The whole point of a boss fight is to be a standout encounter, so after hearing these tracks for the 100th time, I mean, yeah, I hope it's understandable that I've grown sick of them. One of Tomisawa's tracks that I've seen a fair amount of praise for is the Godskin Apostle track, and if I'm being honest, I really don't see it. I don't think it's a bad song, it's just not really my cup of tea. The first phase carries this almost fanatical church energy thanks to the use of lighter notes, while simultaneously underlying it with a sort of distress. It's very arranged and clean, but the energy becomes more and more frenetic as it begins to flow between these high and low octaves. The second phase throws the whole ensemble into disarray, maintaining that energy whilst becoming less structured. The arrangement feels far more scattershot as a result, but there's almost a sense of hope in how it seems to try and tug back to what it once was. This is pretty fitting for a song about people who once dogmatically followed a queen before she was felled, leading to the collapse of their congregation. I realize this is waxing poetics a bit, I'm just trying to convey what it is about the song that I think works as well as it does to garner the approval that it has. Maybe I'm totally off base, if so you can always leave a comment letting me know. Like I said, I'm not trained in music theory or composition, so all of this is strictly layman's interpretation. As for why I don't enjoy the track as much as others, it's really just a preferential thing. I don't know, I just don't really care for the song. Estelle's OST on the other hand is easily among my favorites in the entire game. It simultaneously sounds like a Bloodborne track whilst being structured in a way that feels almost befitting of Demon Souls more than anything. It's a very atmospheric track with shrill instrumentation and vocals, the kind that really gets the hairs on the back of your neck stood up. There's also a constant sense of escalation where the music never really sees any kind of release or payoff. There's no moment where the whole orchestra bellows out a climactic series of notes or ramps up into a higher tempo. It's just endlessly building, kinda like Lady Maria's OST where it just feels never ending. And I think that's appropriate for this Lovecraftian moth scorpion thing. You've probably already surmised with them being my favorite bosses in the game, but yeah, I love Placidus Axe and Godfrey's OSTs. They're fantastic. I don't know how to describe it, but Godfrey's music seems to almost carry this sort of reverence for the character himself, almost like a respect for his sheer presence alone. There's an immediate excitement to the track as it erupts off a short series of notes. It's as if the music itself is acknowledging his arrival, almost like a parade meant for a king. There's also a wide variety of instrumentation going on here, giving the music this feeling of going all out as if the band itself is showing great pride in Godfrey's ability to fight. Then Hoarah enters the fray and the music immediately becomes much more frenetic and almost destructive in a way. All sense of regality is thrown completely out the window in favor of this perilous ensemble of noticeably heavier notes and a rampant tempo which makes it clear just what it is you are now facing off against. It's really intense, but the song never feels as if it's completely lost control or gone into disarray either. Hoarah isn't Godfrey turned into a mindless and frenzied husk, he's just Godfrey pissed off. So I think it's fitting for the music to maintain that element of his character. Godfrey is so fucking cool. Then there is Placidus Axe, and my god, this track. FromSoft has always had a habit of hitting higher octaves when it comes to the more mystical elements of their worlds, especially when it comes to dragons. FromSoft dragons, regardless of the game, have always been held up as these ancient, powerful beings with their own dedicated histories, and Elden Ring is by no means an exception. Appropriately, for a multi-headed lord of dragons, Placidus Axe's music feels very harmonious, with the vocals and string instruments both hitting similarly high notes, while the horns and percussion maintain a steadfast beat, so as to maintain that sense of unyielding power. A fun little factoid about Placidus Axe is that the root of his own name, Placidus, or Placidus, actually translates to peaceful. Placidus Axe does seem to be rather peaceful and wise, however he's by no means to be taken lightly either. As the fight persists and the music enters the second phase, the vocals begin to waver and the strings grow increasingly shrill, conveying the tragedy of this ancient being finally taking its last exerted breaths. At the same time, the percussion and horns begin to ramp up. No living being is ever as dangerous as it becomes when it's backed into a corner, and Placidus Axe's music conveys that perfectly. You may be winning the fight, but you have not won the fight. And to underestimate Placidus Axe now would be a costly mistake. It's also worth noting that the pause between phase 1 and 2 in Placidus Axe's track actually plays into the fight, unlike many other boss tracks. Placidus Axe begins his phase 2 by disappearing for a brief time, at which point the music will slowly begin to pick up once more, only for Placidus Axe to reappear in a storm cloud of red lightning and come barreling down at the player in a ferocious display of aggression as the music erupts once more. Oh my god, he is so goddamn cool. And finally, there is Yuka Kitamura, perhaps the most storied of these composers thanks to her work on Dark Souls 2, Dark Souls 3, Bloodborne, and Sekiro Shadows Die Twice prior to her working on Elden Ring. Her contributions include The Tunnels, Great Underground Rivers, Eternal City, Academy of Raya Lucaria, Caelid, Catacombs, Lindell, Divine Tower, The First Formidable Foe track, The Amoured, Grave Wardens, Death's Kindred, Dragon, Black Knives, Fire Giant, Regal Ancestor Spirit, Melania, Blade of Mikola, and finally Renala, Queen of the Full Moon. Of these tracks, I want to highlight Melania, Renala, and the Regal Ancestor Spirit. Melania's track is one that I initially didn't care for purely by association with a boss that I consider pretty bad. You know, for those of you who missed that, what was it, hour of the critique? And to be fair, it also didn't help having heard the opening to both phases so many times. Jesus Christ, I heard those particular parts so many fucking times, as I'm sure all of you have. But even still, I can't even deny that the track is honestly phenomenal. Easily one of the best tracks in the game, if you ask me. I really respect the fact that they chose to be as reserved as they were with this track. The second phase, of course, has a high amount of energy to it, but it never feels as if it's going too over the top or trying too hard to be as epic as possible. I imagine it had to be somewhat tempting to go that route given it was being composed for the featured late game super boss, so I really appreciate the fact that they chose to go for a more tactful and atmospheric route. I wish they could have shown that degree of restraint with designing the actual boss, but, you know, hey, no sense beating a dead horse. And for what it's worth, Melania's track does ramp up, it just doesn't go completely insane like you might think it would. Phase 1 of Melania's track is by far one of the most atmospheric boss tracks in the game, with the vocals being notably reserved as the strings, bells, and woodwinds carry the song. There's a definite sense of melancholy, but there's also this lack of release or even really build-up that makes you feel almost suspicious. Like we're not really seeing the full extent of this boss's might. I doubt I need to explain why that feels so appropriate for Melania, the Blade of Mikola, so I'm just gonna leave it saying this is really damn fitting. Then Melania's second phase begins, and that's when the music really begins to ramp up. The vocals explode onto the scene, and the heavier instruments begin to dominate while the strings and woodwinds ramp up in tempo. It immediately conveys to the player the sheer power of Melania, the Blade of Mikola, in a way that is crystal clear. But there are also breaks in the track with the strings and woodwinds taking back over and even slowing as the vocals simmer down, maintaining the somber tone which defined the first phase of the track. Given that Melania's character canonically grows more ill as she allows the Scarlet Rot to take over, this track's composition is honestly perfect. Seriously, it is an outstanding piece of music, marred only by the fact that the lyrics mean nothing and are AI generated, which is completely inappropriate for a game like this. Then there's Renala's OST, which is honestly just, let's call it what it is. It's depressing. Not only does it suit her tragic backstory, but if you would allow me one more dig, it's also attached to a severely disappointing boss fight. In all seriousness though, this track is easily among the best to come out of Elden Ring. The moment the first notes drop, the track is just dripping with this tragic softness that never really escalates into the grandiose eruptions of music that we've come to expect from these games. The song does occasionally escalate, but it never really sees any sort of payoff, no bellowing of mighty notes, only a constant dying down before it can ever fully crescendo. This to me conveys a sort of incompleteness, a lingering burden that deprives one of their ability to feel joy, which is perfectly fitting for Renala given what occurred between her and her family. The music does eventually pick up for phase 2, but it's not bombastic so much as mystical and perplexing. It does a great job at conveying the scope of her power without betraying her characterization and feeling out of touch with Renala or even the fight itself. And finally, there's the Regal Ancestor Spirit, which to me is one of the low-key greatest songs in the entire soundtrack. Compared to everything else in the game, the Ancestor Spirit OST is just so uniquely mystical in how it sounds. There's this naturalistic energy to it that I think goes a long way in complementing this wordless story about the beauty of nature and how you're needlessly destroying it by attacking this completely innocent spirit which has already seen its fair share of suffering. It's such a beautiful track and yet so haunting at the same time that I honestly believe it to be among the most powerful pieces of music in this entire game. To call it phenomenal honestly feels like a I'm underselling it. It is a genuinely remarkable piece of music. But I suppose I've spent enough time talking about Elden Ring's sound design and OST. I realize the bulk of this video was talking about the OST, but sound design is one of those things that's really hard to talk about, at least for me, unless it's noticeably bad. But thankfully, Elden Ring's sound design is pretty great. As far as the OST goes, on the whole I think it's pretty great. There really aren't any especially weak tracks musically speaking, it's more just questionable uses or misuses of certain tracks. And to their credit, there is some downright phenomenal orchestration to be found here. If I had to pick a top 5 in no particular order, it'd probably be Moog, Placidusax, Renala, Melania, and the Ancestor Spirit. That's not to take anything away from other great tracks, just to say that I found this particular handful to be downright incredible. Elden Beast, Estelle, Radon, Malekith, and Godfrey's theme would also probably come next in the top 10. There are some great ambient tracks as well, with Song of Honor and the Song of Lament easily being among the best of them in my opinion. Though I can't deny that the use of AI-generated vocals is a major bummer to see, and because I feel it needs to be hammered home, I seriously hope From Soft avoids going this route with their OST in the future. Elden Ring's OST is overall really good, so imagine how much better it would be with proper lyrics and vocals. As far as the sound design itself goes, there's definitely a sense of repetition as you play the game more, such as the sound of breaking stance and the roars of dragons, but there's little if nothing to really criticize as far as the effects themselves go. The more subdued nature of the overworld does a great job at helping those finer moments to stand out more than they already would, and it always manages to hit whenever you reach an area with its own unique track, or even when you just happen across one of the vendors playing their own non-diegetic music. One of them even pays homage to Gehrman's theme from Bloodborne.